Okay, I'm going to get started in a minute. What's going on, Sean S? Glad to see you here. Okay, I'm going to get started. Because I'm working with a new software. I'm working with StreamYard instead of my regular YouTube. So it's taking a minute for me to get used to it. Okay, welcome to tonight's live stream. I'm gonna get started right now. And tonight's topic is going to be about how to plan your own run of comic book storylines. Now, I decided to talking about the run of comic book storylines because I wanted to teach writers how to lay out the plans for how to develop your storylines and your whole story arc. Now, most comic book writers, they usually plan their run of comics in an outline format before they write a single word. So, most comic writers, they usually start their runs with an outline, and in that outline, they answer a single critical question. And that critical question is, what do I want to say about this character? What type of statement do I want to make with this character? And after they make that statement of what they want to say and what they want to make with that character, they then start building on what they want to do as related to the overall theme for the character transformation arc they are planning. So they will start with a general question as related to the what they want to do, and then from there they start laying out what they are planning as related to the overall theme. So that theme is very important as related to your character, because when you have a your theme set up, then you have something to build your series of storylines on. So you want to start out asking that question, okay, what do I want to say about this character? What is the mission statement I want to make about this character? And why is that important? For example, when I started with the ISIS series with the first book, Amari's Revenge, I didn't want to just introduce the ISIS character to readers. I also wanted to have a mission statement for the character when I first reintroduced her to readers. So what I wanted to do when I started my run was say, okay, this is me reintroducing the ISIS character to readers in this story. And as I'm reintroducing readers to this character, and I'm starting my run, I want to make this statement about her. And I wanted to show this in my statement that Isis was a goddess next door. And in that statement, she was looking to serve the people. And as I was planning using that as the theme for my run, I wanted to talk about how, as she was this goddess next door and this girl next door who was all American, she needed to learn about how to serve the people. So that was the theme for the start of the series. Was she was going to be this goddess next door, and she was going to learn how to serve people because the approaches she used when she was younger and during the periods of the 20th century would not work effectively in the 21st century. So that's what I used as my theme, was this whole um, former teacher becoming the student and learning about life. And that was the foundation for the run. Now, once you've established your theme as related to the story you want to tell, then what you want to do is start planning your set of arcs. Now, in comic books, stories are not told in one, are not told like a novel with different chapters. Comics tell a story with story arcs, and usually a story arc can go anywhere from one issue to 6 issues, but most writers usually keep it to 2 to 4 issues, because if you make it too long, what will happen is the reader is going to stop engaging with the story because they believe that the plot will be meandering. So most writers, what they want to do is make sure that that story is going at a pace where it's usually 2 to 4 issues, so that readers can come in and readers can have incentive to go out here and pick up the next issue, or to go back and pick up the back issues. So there are 3 types of arcs that your writers need to understand. One is the single issue arc, which is usually used for the first issue in some cases, if the depending on the budget. The second is the 2 to 3 issue arc, and then there is the overreaching arc. Now I'm going to start with the overreaching arc, because the overreaching arc is directly connected to the theme. And the overreaching arc is directly connected to the theme because that one is related to the overall theme of the book, which is about what the writer wants us to learn about this character and how this character is going to change over the course of the issues in the run. So in the overreaching arc, the writer has to lay out their plan for what they want to not only say about this character, but how they want this character to change over the course of the stories in the overall series. So the overreaching arc is very important, and a writer has to lay that out as related to their theme, and they have to lay that out as related to that theme because this is the foundation for all of the stories you're going to write in your story arc. So if you don't really know what you want to write about as related to your story arcs in the beginning with the overreaching arc, your book is going to have lots of problems as related to your storytelling. So it's very important for a writer to sit there and give a real solid plan as related to their overreaching arc, because it's that overreaching arc that really gives the writer that blueprint to be able to see their vision long term. So the overreaching arc and the theme are extremely important to your storytelling, and you really need to focus on what you want to say in that overreaching arc. Now, when I was doing the ISIS series again, the overreaching arc I was planning was about Isis learning about the world, Isis going through this character transformation arc where she's coming back to the world after a hiatus from the late 20th century into the 21st. And she's looking to think that she can go back into that world and go back to her original job of teaching. But when you've been gone for 40 years, you can't go back to that job that you originally had because things have changed. And again, it was about this goddess next door, this girl next door learning about the world. And it all went into the story of the teacher becoming the student. And as the student was learning about life, she could learn what she needed to know in order to help people. So that overreaching arc was what the theme of it was about, again, establishing that vision. But I had to do that in the introductory story where, okay, I'm bringing this character back. I need to reintroduce this character. And that's where I started the first story arc, which was Amari's Revenge, which brought the character back and reintroduced the character to readers, and then gave us a reason to get to know Isis, get to know who she is, what her mission is, and why we should care about her. So that's one of the things you really want to do in your first issue as related to your run, is you really want to come out with a very strong first issue, because your first issue is the book where you're going to make your first impression on the reader. And as a writer, you have to make sure that your story is extremely strong in that first issue. So in a first issue, you really have to really focus on, again, your themes as related to your story and your overall plans for your overreaching arc, because this is the book that is going to start being the first building block for your overreaching arc. This is the most important book as related to your overreaching arc, because you are introducing this character to readers, and you are introducing this character to so that we can get to know them and we can have a reason to care about them. And that's the most important question you have to answer as related to your story, is why should the reader care? Because if you can't make the reader care about that first issue, then they're not going to have an incentive to come in as related to future issues. So you really want to be strong in that first issue of any run of comics or serialized stories, because this is the first book that the reader is picking up. And with the first book that the reader picks up, you have to make a very strong first impression. All the plot lines have to be solid, all of the characterizations have to be solid, and all of the story points need to be strong, because with that story, that's how you're going to start building the blocks of that overall overreaching arc, and that's how you're going to build your character transformation process. So when you're doing a run, it is important to start out strong as related to your writing, and do make sure everything is solid as related to, again, your plot, your characters, and the conflicts you're setting up, and your story points, so that you can move that series forward. Now, again, the first book in the ISIS series was Amari's Revenge, and it was the book that reintroduced ISIS to readers, but it also started to reestablish her relationships with Esteem, and it also brought her into the modern universe I started in the novel The Temptation of John Hayes. So with that, I was looking to build on the character and start that arc. And after Amari's Revenge, where we reintroduced the character to readers, I decided to start building Isis's storyline in The Ultimate Fight. Now, The Ultimate Fight is a book where I really start building on the blocks that I started with Amari's Revenge, and Ultimate Fight showed us, Isis starting to build that life for herself. It really showed her starting to make these plans to go back to what she wanted to do. And that's all part of starting to build those blocks for that overreaching arc. Do I have plans to introduce any new heroes? It depends on the stories and what I get inspired by. I have other characters like Lilith Graves, who's going to be a hero Mobar in Eternal Night. So if I get an inspiration, I'll bring a new character in. But right now I'm working with the characters I have right now, and it's a lot of work working with 3 or 4 books. And I don't know if I could take on another character right now, because it's a lot of work putting stories together. And when you're building the blocks of a story arc, you have to really make sure everything is solid. So if you're starting a run, you want to be able to start building that momentum, and that momentum is very important. That's why the first 2 to 3 books, like Amari's Revenge and Ultimate Fight, were very important, because it was building that momentum for the story. Now, the second story, this one was building on the introduction of Isis, but also was building on the foundation of it by establishing the overall storyline. Now, this book was very important because this book, while it introduces Isis and her plans to go start her career, she runs into the Greek goddess Nemesis, and this Greek goddess Nemesis is very integral to Isis's overall plans for her career. Now, she had this plan to be a teacher, and this leads into the conflict. And I'm not going to give away too much, but the story arc starts with this book, and it really starts to build that momentum towards moving the story forward. Now, the third book, The Beauty Myth, which I gave a refresh cover this year. This one, what's going on, Chris? Chris Brown is the creator of Omega Black, and I gotta go get the comic. I don't think I have it in front of me. Okay. Here it is. Chris is the creator of Omega Black, and I'm going to be doing the editing for the Kickstarter for this. And you can get Chris's book on Amazon.com right now, but he's doing a Kickstarter for a larger manga version, and I'm editing on that script. But I'm going to get back to doing story arcs. And again, The Beauty Myth built on the first books, and this third one, this one introduces one of the major antagonists for Isis, and this book introduces one of the big villains that is coming up. And again, you need to have your plans for your bad guys. And when you're doing a book, slowly you want to build up the rogues gallery as you're doing your run, because you want to be able to give your characters conflicts that fit within the theme of your run, and you want to be able to expand on the points as related to your run and the stories in your run. So you really want to be out there, and you want to make sure that every bad guy fits within the theme of your overall plan for your run, and that each character fits organically, because that's really integral to the character development. Because with your character development, it's something that you want to show. You want to really show how this character is a hero, or how this character has to go through this process of change. You really want to show that in each of your stories, so that we see this character, we see their faults, and we see how each story shows how they run into an obstacle as related to issues they are having with themselves. And those conflicts, as they're trying to overcome the bad guy, are teaching them things about themselves that allow them to grow. So when you're doing that run of stories, and each story arc is you're doing, like each 2 to 3 issue arc you're doing, you really want to show this character having to deal with these personal issues, and it's them dealing with these personal issues that will show the readers the character development this character is going through, show us how this character is growing and changing, and show us that this character can learn about themselves and learn about the issues that they're having to deal with. So that's why when you're doing a run, you just don't want to just do one story after the other just randomly. You really want to have a cohesive plan, because each story is related to that character transformation arc. It is related to how we're going to see this character change, and each conflict they have to deal with is related to showing us different aspects of their character. And it's all of those different aspects that allow readers to relate to a character, identify with their struggles. And as they're identifying with their struggles, what they're doing is having incentive to continue reading the stories and continue buying the books, whether from the newest book to the back books, or from the back books all the way to the current books. That's why it's important to have a plan for your run of stories, because when you have a plan for your run of stories, what happens is you have the building blocks to build that arc, and that arc is supposed to build momentum. Now, everything is supposed to be building to in the overreaching arc, but the whole thing is you want each of the story arcs to be a building block in that overall overreaching arc. So you want each building block to build further momentum and show that character growth, that character progression, that character change. And after I did the beauty myth, which dealt with Isis's issues as related to her feelings of inadequacy about her own beauty, and the ultimate fight, which dealt with Isis and her issues as related to dealing with Nemesis as a bully, and Isis and Amari's revenge, where she was dealing with her issues as related to dealing with an old enemy. I decided to move the conflict forward in Isis, My Sister, My Frenemy. Now, Isis, My Sister, My Frenemy, this was a book that took a story point from Amari's revenge with Isis and her reconnection with Esteem, and it built it into a storyline about her learning about having a relationship with her sister. So this story was important because it related to Isis and her job search, but it also related to her relationship with her sister. Would I consider a crossover with Chris Mobar? Yeah, I would consider it if he wanted to, but it's like two different universes and two different sets of characters. If he wanted to do that, I'd be open to it. But with My Sister, My Frenemy, I wanted to build on that story arc. And this book was integral to the character's development because she had to learn how to work with her sister, and she also had to deal with a major rejection. So this story really was the one where she started learning about some of the philosophies as related to being a new Heliopolitan goddess, and it was a major cornerstone, like this book, The Beauty Myth, in the character transformation of Arc of Isis. So each story again builds on the next one and shows further development of the characters and characters learning a bit more about themselves, growing more, and learning what they need to change. And that's all part of that story arc. And the overall story arc, concluded with after My Sister, My Frenemy, where Isis learned about her issues with All About the Goddess, where she had to learn how to apply some of the things that Esteem taught her in My Sister, My Frenemy, and learn how to help people out as she helped a college student deal with a campus stalker who was coming after her, and she had to learn how to be vulnerable and open herself up. That's what the art modeling was a metaphor for, and learning how to do things differently. So this story, while it was a mystery story, it relates to Isis's character transformation arc, and it concluded the first story arc, which really introduced the character, introduced the conflict, and then this showed the character making a change that would allow her to move forward. So the first couple of books of the Isis series, these first 5 books, these were the foundation of the series and allowed me to further build towards the overreaching arc, but they comprise the first major story arc of the series. Now, each story would have been like 2 to 3 issues in a comic book, but what I wanted to do here was show how it led to the parts of the overreaching arc. Each story builds into another story, and that's what led to the character making those changes and making those changes to move forward. Now, that first story arc is very important again because that first story arc, it lays that foundation for the overall run. So each story, again, has to be very solid. Each story has to be very consistent. And each story has to do a good job of establishing all of those characters, what they want to do, what conflicts they have to deal with, and why we should care. Because, again, those foundations are what are going to build on the momentum that will generate those sales for a comic. That's what that's what part of building those first couple of story arcs is very important. For example, when I was just recently reading Kurt Busiek's Avengers, And he did a masterful job of re-establishing the Avengers in those first 6 or 7 issues, establishing why they were Earth's mightiest heroes and showing us why the Avengers were important. I remember reading those issues, and I remember back in the 90s, they talked about, the X-Men were the most popular team, and the Avengers were practically irrelevant. And Kurt Busiek came in, and he reestablished the Avengers as Earth's mightiest heroes by, in his theme, establishing why we needed the Avengers and why the Avengers were important, because he established them as having to deal with these big threats, these grand epic battles. I mean, with him and George Perez together, they showed us why the Avengers were Earth's mightiest heroes and why they take on these grand menaces. I mean, he put together fights with the Squadron Supreme, with Ultron, which was that Ultron story is a practical classic. The Count Nefaria arc, many of the arcs showed us why the Avengers were important and why we should care about the Avengers. So when I look at that overreaching arc, Kurt Busiek shows you how to put together a run of solid comics. And the storytelling there started with him focusing on what he wanted to do with those characters. He wanted to show us that overall theme. Why do we need the Avengers? Why the Avengers are important, and why the Avengers were Earth's mightiest heroes. And in each of his stories, he shows us why they were important, whether it be taking on those big threats or showing us how other smaller heroes of smaller teams like the New Warriors, like Firestar and Justice, looked up to the Avengers, and they saw the Avengers as role models. And that was something that was also a major part of it, and showing us how the Avengers worked to be that ultimate ideal for a team. I remember one book, he showed how the Fantastic Four and the X-Men and all these other characters couldn't handle things that the Avengers could. And again, showing us the importance of the Avengers, what made them Earth's #1 team, and why they were valuable to the reader. And that's also a part of building your overreaching arc, is showing us why this character is somebody we should care about and why we should want to continue buying their stories. So when I was reading those Kurt Busiek Avengers books, they really showed me how you put together an overreaching arc for a run, and how each story works together towards building towards a larger picture of this character or this group of characters, to show us why we should care about these characters and why these characters are so important that readers read them every month. Yeah, George Perez, I love his art. I mean, I have some of his books from the 70s. I have this Teen Titans, Harrison 1106. I have a lot of those books, and it looks so powerful. And that run of Avengers, when you really look at it, it's an amazing run. It just shows you, again, another one of those runs that shows you what happens when a writer has a clear plan for the story they want to tell and a clear direction for what they want to go in, and want a whole overall outline for what they want to show us regarding these characters, so that each story that they write and publish has a direct connection to other stories in the series, and a direct connection in showing us why these characters are people we need to care about. So when you're doing that run, you want each story to be unique, each story to be special, and each story to really show us different aspects of this character. And you want each story to show us why we really want to keep reading these characters. So as these characters develop and grow, and as we learn more about these characters, this really helps the readers really connect and really see this character as someone special. So when you've done your first arc and laid that foundation, that's when you have to really start focusing on following up. Now, when you do your first run of stories, like I did with the ISIS series, you started your run, but with introducing the character, introducing the conflict, and introducing the issues the character faces. But then after you do that, you want to follow up on many of the story points, and sometimes these books actually are bit more important than the other ones, because a lot of times the readers, they're not going to come in on these books that early on. They'll go back to them, which is what I found out numerous times. A lot of people, they came in on this book at the end of the arc and they went back. So this was the conclusion of the first story arc, but most people came in here. So you want to make them strong so that when they go back, they have that incentive to go forward. And when you have your run and you lay your foundation, you want them to go forward, and you have to give them that reason to go forward. And that reason for going forward was the Isis Wrath of the Cyber Goddess, which is the first book with the Bill Walko cover. But this was the book I wanted to put a great cover on, because this was going to be following up on the story arc I started in the Beauty Myth and building on the points that I established in the Beauty Myth. So this story is a follow-up story, and the follow-up story is about building on the story points you establish in those early stories, picking a story point, and then moving the story forward. Meanwhile, you're continuing to develop your hero, and they're continuing to grow. But what you want to do is develop that story that brings us a major challenge for the character, a major conflict for the character, and something that will be something that when they overcome that challenge really shows this character growing. Because follow-up arcs, what they do is show how this character, that yes, they made some mistakes or something happened in the first story, but they're going to learn something in the second story. And I remember one of the great second follow-up arcs was that the ultimate one was the Spider-Man story with Green Goblin and Gwen Stacy. And that was a follow-up to years of build-up that really paid off. And that was something that was one of my influences when I thought about starting to do follow-up stories. And a follow-up story, again, is about, yes, you're bringing back an old bad guy, but what you want to do as you're bringing back that old bad guy is further develop the relationship between the hero and the villain, and really define the motivations for them being against each other. Because that follow-up storyline is about not only building on the foundation of this bad guy, but it's also about showing us why these characters are opposed to each other. So that follow-up storyline, that's the one where we really start to see the intensity of the relationship continue to build up. We start to see the principles and philosophies behind these characters and what they stand for. We really start to see how these two characters really don't like each other, and how in some cases how it's related to their beliefs, how it's related to their ideologies, and how it relates to them and what they stand for. And in this story, the hero really has to really stand up for what they believe in, and they have to show us what makes them a hero is their principles and them standing on their values. So these stories are usually major stories, and this one was a major story for the Isis character. This one was, again, building on the Beauty Myth and what was in there, and also showing us those core principles as the character. Now, when you have a follow-up arc, it usually, again, shows us some such major character development that you need to cool the stories down a bit so that the reader doesn't get overwhelmed. And when you're doing a run, sometimes after a major storyline, you don't want to just jump into another major storyline, because what's going to happen is the reader needs that minute to cool off. Thank you, Yak Diesel, for the don't the super chat. Really appreciate it. But I'll take a minute to answer your question before I go into the cool off story. With the current pandemic, what long term effects do you see on mainstream comics, as well as new opportunities for independent creators like you? Well, with the long term effects I see for the comic industry is they're going to have to realize that the direct market is no longer going to be able to serve them. So, for over 25 years, as the comic book industry has suffered, we have seen them still try to hold on to this direct market model where the publishers make money, but the comic shops have to wind up eating the cost. And over the last couple of years, as Marvel and DC and many indies have gone out here and gone on with this direct market model, which has no returnability, comic shops have been eating the costs and buying these books. And no matter what the quality is, the comic shop is stuck with them. And this is what's led to over 100 some odd comic stores closing. But with the current pandemic, almost all of the comic shops are closed due to these state government orders, which say that they're a non-essential business. And now the comic book industry has no place to sell things because Diamond is closed. And so they're going to have to try to find new distributors. And they're also going to be forced to go out here and create better quality comics. Because one of the reasons why the comic book industry is in such dire straits is because mainstream comics takes its audience for granted, and they don't really make quality product like the recent woke New Warriors or many of these other social justice comics, which really, they don't have overreaching arcs. They don't have character transformation arcs like I've talked about, and they have no reason to care. It's all about promoting an agenda and identity politics. But good comics, they have overreaching arcs, and they have full character transformation arcs that make us care. Mobar7170 asks, your antagonist are as intriguing as your protagonist. What are your inspirations for your antagonists, if any, while keeping them as powerful as the heroes? Well, when I'm doing villains, I usually focus on them first. And I remember the first villain I did for the ISIS series, Eastine, she was inspired by actress Sally Richardson Whitfield. I saw her do voiceover work in Gargoyles, and I also saw her in movies like Low Down, Dirty Shame, and Posse. So when I looked at her, I said, she's a great actress, and she's playing heroes all the time, but you really get noticed is when you play the heel role. So that was the inspiration for the Eastine character. And I wanted to, again, write that bad guy, because bad guys are the most important thing to any comic run, because bad guys drive the conflict and bad guys drive the story. Now, Nemesis, when I designed her, I wanted to not just do a villain for the Rogues Gallery. I wanted to do more of a rival type character. And I was thinking about Lucy Lawless and Xena, and I came up with the idea for the Nemesis character. And I thought of the idea of her being this rival to Isis, because she was going to be like the Greek counterpart to Isis. So with the Nemesis character, I wanted to make the idea of her being a rival. And later on, I thought about the whole kind of rivalry between Thor and Hercules in Marvel Comics. And that was also one of the inspirations for their relationship. So different villains, I get different ideas. Like for the Rahima Sanders character, I was reading those, what people call the worst Wonder Woman comics, but I saw potential in the villain Dr. Cyber, and I decided to use that as one of the foundations for the Rahima character. One of the other villains, Golden Shine, came from one of my other concepts I had come up with. I came up with this joke character called Michael Abs, who was going to be this supermodel called Super Spy. And I had this villain called Golden Shine, who was this tan-toned, buff guy. But then I said the idea was so absurd that, this guy puts on baby oil and he's all muscular. So I decided to use that. I changed the gender of the character, and then I decided to use it for the ISIS series. So I get inspirations for different characters from different things that I see. But when I do villains, I'm always focused on their story, because when you have a villain, they are the most integral part of the story, because if they can't really drive the conflict, then the reader has no reason to care. And when you have a villain, they have to be really on point, because it's their relationship to the hero that makes us care about why the hero should beat them. So when you're doing arch enemies in a run, you need to show how this villain relates to the hero, and you need to show why this person is someone the hero needs to beat. And that's not only related to the physical aspects, it's also related to the psychological, and it's also related to the emotional. And that's just something that a lot of writers don't really focus on with these arch enemies and their rivalries. What you want to do is go out here and, again, build that psychology as related to the relationship. So when I was doing ISIS series stories, I was sitting there going, I really want to focus on that psychology between these heroes and these villains, because it's that relationship that keeps people coming back. I remember with reading X-Men, how Charles Xavier and Magneto, them having these ideals, they made them like they were these arch enemies because they stood for what they believed in. And when you're doing villains, you really want to have that going on. Like Reed Richards and Doctor Doom, you have Reed Richards, who is selfless, and you have Doctor Doom, who is selfish. And they contrast each other, but their principles are the thing that they're really fighting against. Now, with heroes, male heroes, you can do that where they're fighting about their principles. But with women, you really have to focus on the emotional aspects, because women tend to focus on the personal. And when I'm doing ISIS series stories, I always focus on the personal issues between the two characters. Whenever she's having a rivalry with a bad guy, it's always about something related to the personal, because women always take things personally, and women are very emotional. So they take things personally and emotionally, and that's got to resonate with the reader, because they need to see those villains taking things personally and really dealing with that, because that's what they deal with in their life. Oberon, I'm glad you like Golden Shine. I'm probably planning on bringing her back maybe for the third story arc. I mean, I'm not finished with that character. I have a lot more I want to do with that character. I got a lot of inspirations and influences from watching people on the internet. And thank you, Yak Diesel. Um, I did want to bring that depth to the block, because that relationship was also very important. I mean, the block and John Haynes, that block's jealousy, and John Haynes dealing with that vicious cycle he was dealing with. I really wanted to bring that character development there, because when you're having a hero taking on a bad guy, that relationship has to be there for the reader to really care about what's going on, and they can invest in the characters and the story. But when I was doing, again, ISIS, I followed that up. But whenever you're doing like a heavy storyline like Wrath of the Cyber Goddess, you really want to give the reader a cool down. And one issue stories, when you're doing story arcs or a run, are a great way to cool down the reader and still continue to develop whatever storylines and themes you want to do. But the cool down story, it allows the reader to breathe. It allows the reader to digest what they've read. And it allows the reader to, take a moment and relax. Now, when I was doing Power of the Princess, I was following up on some story points in Nemesis's Ultimate Fight story, but I wanted to, as I continued to develop the characters, give them a little short one where they could, deal with these issues. And this is what I wanted to do. So when you're doing a one-issue story, it's allowing the reader to get that cool down after a major battle or something like that. And I saw that when Kurt Busiek, after he did this storyline with all of the Legion of the Unliving, he brought the Beast in to have a storyline with Wonder Man. And that's how you cool the readers off and give them that minute to breathe before you put them back in to the intense action. Now, The Wrath of the Cyber Goddess storyline, this was a story that introduced the John Haynes character into ISIS's part of the SJS Direct universe, and I really wanted to continue further developing ISIS's character transformation arc. And part of that character transformation arc was her having to learn how to do things in the 21st century and learning how to work with people in the 21st century, because the way she worked with people during the 20th century, she was dealing with racism, she was dealing with Jim Crow, she was dealing with different aspects, but I wanted to show how the world had changed and how she had to deal with people in a changing world. So that was one of the stories I wanted to do with Night of the Vampires, was introduce Isis into this changing world and also show her learning about John Haynes, getting to know John Haynes, and getting to know his business. So I really wanted this story to be, again, we're going to pick up after the cool down and start continuing to move the momentum forward. So what I wanted to do with this one in the run was, again, continue building on that story arc, continue building on that momentum. Now, this was a story that, why it's so thick is because it is the re-continuing of that momentum. And when you're doing a run, you want to continue that momentum with a strong story arc. And that strong story arc gets readers re-engaged after the cool down and the build up to build into the next storyline, because after Isis took on the vampires, she had to take on the boss in Bride of Dracula. Now, Bride of Dracula builds on that momentum and introduces the boss, deals with her conflicts with John Haynes, and really gives us some major character development for both the Isis and the John Haynes characters. So each story, again, is building, but the vampire arc was about continuing to build those characters and continuing to let us get to know more about these characters, the issues that they're having, and the struggles that they're dealing with. So this book, it was one that people really started to pick up. Again, this was another one that people really started to pick up because of the story, but it led to a lot of people going back for the entire run and others coming back for back books. But that's what happens, because when you're building momentum, you want to continue building that momentum. And again, you're going to have individual stories that one will do better than another. And that's what happens in a run. You have some stories that, yeah, they will do a lot better than other stories, but those stories incentivize people to go out here and pick up the backstories or anticipate getting the next story. Now, I had to take another cool down period after those two really intense vampire books, and I also had to deal with the editorial issue because I wanted to conclude the Isis storyline with the vampires, but I had to take a break because of things. But miraculously, I did get a donation and was able to do another book like Samurai Goddess. And Samurai Goddess was a new story that introduced a new villain and also picked up on some story points, because when you're doing a run, you not only want to focus on older characters that you've introduced, you also want to take a minute to introduce new bad guys, and you want to introduce new characters. Now, I did this with Samurai Goddess. I introduced some brand new characters, and I introduced some new aspects for the story, while also continuing. If you were to read the epilogue, you would see a tie-in to Wrath of the Cyber Goddess. So Samurai Goddess, it introduces a new villain, and one minute. Mobar 7170 says, what's also entering is that as a writer, you deal with real life issues while not bogging the readers down with political nonsense. We need the escapism and without keeping things being too far-fetched. How do I accomplish that? Well, when you're a writer and you're working on your run, you really want to focus on your story. And your story is about showing how this character is dealing with these issues and dealing with these problems. And that's not about anything political. Your main focus is on your conflict, and it is mostly focused on showing us why this hero is somebody we should care about. So the big problem that I'm seeing with a lot of woke writers or what they call social justice writers is they put the politics first and the story second. But good writers, we try to put the story first because we understand if the reader can't escape and see these characters and see them as people, then they're not going to care, because most people who buy comics or they buy superhero prose fiction like I do, they want to escape. They are coming to buy these books because they have a hard day at work, their kids have a hard day at school, and they're coming because they want to break from their lives and they want to go to a world where they can escape. But the problem with many of the woke or social justice writers is they want to preach to you, not understanding that the media you're producing is not about preaching, it's about giving people that escape. Moreover, it's also about giving them a solution to their problems, because when you're writing a story, you're not only writing a story just for entertainment, you're trying to sell. And what you're trying to sell is that escape that allows them to take a break from their lives and possibly have a solution. And I'm going to get back into when you're doing a run, again, you want to be able to introduce those new characters. And yeah, I introduced a couple of new characters as I was building the second story arc. I introduced the Lilith Graves character. I introduced Dracula as a bad guy. And I introduced the Ketchamura woman, who was the sword in the back, as a bad guy. And you want to be able to introduce those new bad guys because they allow you to have some diversity as related to your rogues gallery. Because the initial villains that you design, yes, they're very exciting, but you always need variety and you need diversity when you're doing a run, because each bad guy you have the hero take on and each bad guy they beat, what happens is it becomes repetitive and boring. So if you have heroes and they're taking on bad guys every month and it's the same bad guys, the reader gets bored. So when you're doing a run, you always want to try to bring in some new bad guys to mix it up and also show the reader new aspects as related to the character, show us new aspects as related to their development, and to show us how this character can overcome any sort of obstacle and show us different aspects as related to their weaknesses. Now, with the Bride of Dracula story, I wanted to show some weaknesses for the Isis character. Yes, she's a Nubian goddess, but I wanted to show how there were some psychological weaknesses as related to the character, as she thought that her powers were the only thing that would allow her to overcome everything. But in this story, she wound up getting caught by Dracula, which showed her some weakness as related to her psychology. And I put some psychology in there because that's one of the great weaknesses for a character with those godlike powers like Superman and Thor, is showing those weaknesses. And with the Samurai Goddess story, I wanted to show the character's weaknesses as related to her having to deal with one of these cerebral type villains, because the Kachamura character was a villain who tended to use psychology and manipulation. And yes, you have these godlike characters with these incredible powers, but you have to deal with when you have a character like that, they have to deal with a little bit more psychology, and that's a great weakness. Now, when I did those stories, I also wanted to bring in another villain, and this was a book where I introduced another villain, House of Isis. I wanted Bill to do this cover, but I just didn't have the resources to do it. I had a really great concept for this cover, and in this story, I wanted to bring Isis to Harlem, bring her back to her Harlem neighborhood, and I really wanted to deal with the aspect of Isis being this goddess next door. So with this story, I wanted to take another breather for a minute to show why the Isis character is important and really reestablish the whole concept of the goddess next door. So with this story, I had her taking on this hustling Hotep high priestess from Harlem, and I wanted to show how a lot of these pro-blacks, they think in that skin color is the thing that makes you black, but I wanted to show the internal character traits, and I wanted to explore internal character traits with this story. So I wrote this one in response to a lot of the pro-blacks who were saying that the character wasn't black enough because of the light skin. And I wanted to deal with that light skin, dark skin aspect to show that what makes a person black is the content of their character. And sometimes we can't think that skin folk are all kinfolk. So this was a story that I wrote to really establish the character, really get people to really see the character's mission and see how much the character cared about people. But this was a fun story that I did, and it really was a really good one. But it was like a new introduction to another villain, which is the priestess Anjara, and again bringing another bad guy into the series. Now, after that, I went back to the vampire arc that I started in Night of the Vampires and Bride of Dracula, and I wanted to build on those stories that I had previously established. And with Escape from Transylvania, we got the conclusion to the vampire arc, and we got the conclusion to the story that started Isis's relationship with John Haynes. And from each of the images, we see how that relationship changes. We see how Isis and Night of the Vampires are standing alone, how they're standing against each other, and in this final image, they're standing together. So we start to see the character transformation process over the course of 3 stories, and we see how this character grows and progresses just by the covers alone. So when you're doing a run and you go out here and you're doing a story arc, you really want to show the characters progressing as related to their relationships. You want to see the characters progressing as to their character development, and each story showing us how these characters change, develop, and grow. And with Escape from Transylvania, you really want to I wanted to show how Isis and John's relationship has grown and developed. They started out as rival, with a little bit of a rivalry, and then eventually grew back and learned how to work together to overcome the threat of Dracula and escape from Transylvania. So this was what I call a concluding story. And concluding stories, when you're doing a run, they allow us to get a satisfying ending to the story arc, and that satisfying ending allows us to be able to go out here and be able to say, okay, this storyline is finished. The writer has really done a great job of establishing the conflict, establishing the struggles that the character had to deal with, and then after establishing all of this and these issues that they had to deal with, coming to a satisfying conclusion. So each story arc you do, what story arc you do builds into that overreaching arc for the character's transformation arc, but also allows us to see how these relationships between these characters develop and grow, and how these characters eventually change. Just like the first 3 books, Omari's Revenge, The Beauty Myth, and My Sister My Frenemy, showed how Isis's relationship with Eastine had changed. This storyline between Night of the Vampires, Bride of Dracula, and Escape from Transylvania really showed how Isis's relationship with John really changed. So after I did Escape from Transylvania, I took a break for Fantasy Flashback Fall, but I'll get into that in a minute. Yak Diesel says, House of Isis was another great read. Again, the way it delved into real-life narratives while maintaining the fantastic escapism was one of the best aspects of it. I thank you very much for that compliment. I really want to, again, I had been getting attacked by pro-blacks before I had written House of Isis. So I really wanted to make that commentary while I was doing this fantasy story. And when you're doing this fantasy story, you want to keep your commentary between the lines, and you want to be able to keep people involved in the story. Now, a lot of those people, they had issues with the whole light skin and dark skin issue, but I wanted to make sure that the story was not about these personal issues I had. I wanted to make a commentary about what it meant to be a black hero. And for me, a black hero is somebody who wants to help people in the community and genuinely comes from their heart wanting to help people from the community. And it's when you're doing a run, you want to be able to make your commentary between the lines as related to your story, because that commentary is the thing that will make the reader resonate with the readers. And what I saw with a lot of social justice and woke comics is that they're so busy preaching at you and arguing with you that we don't connect with the characters and see why they're important. With House of Isis, I wanted to show why the character was important, why the Goddess Next Door mission was important, and bring readers back to that theme because that theme was integral to the overreaching arc. Mobar 7170 says what is cool is that even though Isis is thousands of years older than John Haynes, it feels like he's her older brother. That wasn't intentional. What I wanted to show was this relationship between the characters, and I wanted to show that even though the Isis character, yes, she's thousands of years old, there's still a lot for her to learn. I mean, she left the world around the 1970s because she was her previous alias had gotten too old, so she had to leave and then she had to come back, but she needed the help and guidance of someone like a John Haynes who knew something about the world. So he sort of knows some things to help her, and she knows some things to help him. So both of them are kind of helping each other, and that's all part of building a good relationship between two characters. Because when you have characters, they have to be able to work with each other, and they have to be able to come together. So what with Isis and John, I really wanted to show how even though Isis isn't this immortal, she still has to live in this human world, and she has to have relationships with people to show her how to navigate that world, because that world is completely different from what she knew in the 20th century. Supremo asks, do I think the latest crisis will kill SJW comics for good? I believe that it may possibly lead to some of these SJW comics winding up dead, but the big problem with the comic book industry is we don't have any editorial with vision. If we had a strong editorial with vision like we had in about 97, 98 when Marvel was relaunching Kurt Busiek's Avengers, Mark Waid's Captain America, and Kurt Busiek's Iron Man, we would have a comic book industry that would be in a stronger place editorially. And many of these SJW books would not have even made it past the query stage, because what's happening now is we still have editorial problems. And the reason why those books are getting through is because a lot of these editors, they're thinking more about politics than anything else. But with these companies hurting, they may wind up letting go a lot of these bad editors. And that may be the thing that eventually kills your SJW comics, because there's only so much red ink a company can bleed before it has to wind up making changes. And they're going to have to really start thinking about doing business differently if they hope to continue getting money from readers. So that's the thing that may kill SJW comics, is if this crisis goes on and they take a big enough loss, they may be forced to let a lot of these people go, and they may be forced to really reevaluate their business and reevaluate their approaches to business, because if the comic shops, can't stay in business right now, they're struggling because of all these woke and SJW books, and with the crisis compounding it, they're going to have to find a way to do things differently. And that different way, it may mean letting these people go and then bringing in more seasoned professionals who can give people the traditional comics that they're used to, with those overreaching arcs, those character transformation arcs, and those story arcs that show us these characters growing and changing, and not all of this political nonsense. Now, after I did the Escape from Transylvania and finished the vampire arc, I decided to go back and revisit a story related to two other Isis series books that I don't have in paperback. One is called Death of a Theta, which was tied to my novel, The Thetas, and I decided to show how Isis was a hero during the golden age of what people call golden age of pulp fiction and comics. And I really wanted to make a commentary about how Black people could not be your superheroes in tights saving the world because of Jim Crow and racism. So we had to approach being a hero completely different than the way your Superman, your Batman, and many other characters did during the Golden Age. And that was a story I did called Imitation of Life. And this was a story that I wanted to really pay my respects to all of those people who fought the good fight during the days of pre-Jim Crow, the lawyers, the doctors, the black professionals who stood in the face of racism and presented that dignified image of black people for all of us to look up to in an era where black people were oftentimes presented in the most negative light in mainstream media. And I wanted to show how we had black professionals and how we had black people working behind the scenes in this story, and how ISIS, as a part of this theta sorority, was helping a young black girl who had just gotten her degree learn how to overcome racism by getting her mind right. So with this story, I wanted to make that commentary about heroes in the Golden Age because I had read about the pulp fiction of the 1930s and Doc Savage and The Shadow, and I had read about the Golden Age of superheroes, and then I found out there were no black publishers back then, so that's why we didn't get black superheroes and black heroes for kids to look up to. So I wanted to show with this story that Isis was a hero back then, and how her approach to being a hero was completely different than it was in like Escape from Transylvania, because she couldn't use the same approaches from then to now. So with this story, I really wanted to make that commentary about being a hero during that dark period, because a lot of times when people look at the Golden Age of comics and superheroes, they look at it from that bright perspective. But I wanted to take us to that dark period because that was a dark period for black people, and we had to struggle as related to it. Mobar 7170, will Isis, John, and East ever deal with extraterrestrial elements in the future as they have dealt with the undead and demonic forces? I don't know. I mean, I don't know if I can fit that in organically into the universe, because what I was really focusing on was primarily supernatural threats, and I would have to find a way to fit that in organically, because if you take a concept and you put it in there and it's not fitting organically, it can throw off an entire run. And when you're doing a run of stories, that's something a writer has to think about, is how these elements fit into a story organically and how they fit as related to the character transformation arc. So when you're doing a series of stories, you really want to think about how each of the stories work with each other. So when I was putting all these stories together, I wanted to show how all the aspects work together organically, so that when people read each of the stories, they see another piece of the character, they see another aspect of the character, and that allows us to get to know this character and show them in a light that shows us a person we can relate to. Now, after I did the fantasy flashback fall, where I took Isis back to the past, I took us back to the present. And I continued with Isis's character transformation arc in Isis All That Glitters. Now, in All That Glitters, I had Isis taking on Goldenshine, this bikini-clad bank robber who was dressed up in these white bikini going out here and robbing banks. And with this story, I wanted to show how the Isis character had to learn how to deal with losing. So this was a story where the character had to learn about being overconfident and thinking that things are easy because Isis is a goddess and she's super strong, and she thinks she can just come in and just be able to waltz past this Goldenshine, who she considers to be like a jobber type villain. And with this story, she gets surprised, and this Goldenshine character manages to get the upper hand on her, and she has to really learn that you can't take these bad guys for granted, and that you have to really think before you take them on. So with this story, I really wanted to make a commentary about things going on as related to social media, because I would see a lot of people on social media doing these outlandish behaviors, like walking down the street in a bikini and doing all sorts of crazy stuff, like going into a store in a bikini and crazy stuff and filming it and looking to get YouTube views and going viral. And I wanted to make that type of commentary with this story, showing that, okay, this character has to deal with the 21st century type bad guy, and these 21st century type bad guys, their motivations are very different than your 20th century bad guys. Because in a traditional bank robber story, you have the superhero, they take on the bank robbers, they tie them up, they beat them, and it's really easy. But what I wanted to show was, okay, here's this woman who was a hero in the 20th century and even in mythical times, and she's running into this 21st century type bad guy who has completely different motivations than your 20th century bad guy. Because your 20th century bad guy, he wants to rob the bank just for the money, but your 21st century bad guy, they're not just robbing a bank for the money, they're robbing the bank for the attention, and they are looking to get other things because social media is such a major part of our lives. So with this story, I really wanted to explore how your social media is a major part of young people's lives, and it leads to them being motivated to participate in many of these crazy and outlandish behaviors. So I wanted to show how you could take an old story like the bank robber story and make it fresh. And not only while I'm making it fresh, show us another aspect of the Isis character that leads to her further personal development and leads to a further development of her character transformation arc. Now, after all that glitter showed us how Isis learned how to deal with defeat, I decided to come in with the main event. Now, the main event is a story where the Isis character is stepping in this squared circle, and she's trying to help out Nemesis from the story arc of Ultimate Fight and Power of the Princess. And this is a story that is another concluding story arc because this one concludes the Nemesis story arc, which started in Ultimate Fight, continued in Power of the Princess. And this one is where Isis is going to this wrestling league in Las Vegas, and she's learning how to deal with an issue she's dealt with all of her life about this fear of using her powers. And this is a story that, again, is a big one because the reason why it's long because this relates to her character transformation arc. And this one is the turning point of the second story arc. And with the second story arc, this one is one that is another follow-up story. But this follow-up story is the turning point that is the next to last book of the second story arc. So all of these books, they make up the second story arc of the Isis series. And again, what I'm doing here is following up on stories I established in the beginning, and then further developing the character, further developing the character's transformation arc, and further building on story points and doing things while I'm further developing on existing story points, going out of my way to introduce new characters like Kachimura, characters like Goldenshine, and characters like the Priestess Anjara in the House of Isis. So when you're doing your run, you want to not only make the second story arc really strong, but you want to be able to go out here and build on those earlier story arcs so that when the reader goes through the series, they can see how everything falls in line with everything else. So that's very important for when you're doing a run, is making sure that all the stories work together so that readers can see a progression as related to the overall overreaching arc. And that's the most important thing when you're doing a run, is you want to be able to build that momentum. You want to be able to keep the reader excited, keep the reader engaged, and keep the reader interested in involved in the story, because each story you're doing is building on what you've established in previous stories. So when you're doing a run of stories, you want all of the books to really fit together organically. You want the books to fit together cohesively so that when the reader goes from the first book, like Amari's Revenge, they can go to the main event and then say, oh, everything that he wrote in Amari's Revenge fits all the way in line with the main event. and I'm seeing how this character is growing. I'm seeing how this character is learning. I'm seeing how this character is progressing. And all of that is what's going to keep the reader buying the books in your run. And that's something when you're planning your run, you really have to think about how all the books work. And that's something I had to think about when I was doing the ISIS series. And right now, I'm working on the getting ready to conclude the ISIS story arc. Um, who was the inspiration for ISIS? The original visual inspiration for ISIS was Halle Berry, but it was also a dream I had about ISIS. But the visual was originally Halle Berry, but then later on, I changed it to Tia Mowry because Tia Mowry has values like ISIS. So it was supposed to be Sally Richardson and Halle Berry, but after I saw what Halle Berry did, I switched the character to Tia Mowry, and now these days she sounds like Tia Mowry whenever I write her. So but that's who those are the two actresses that were the inspiration for ISIS. Um, Mobar, that's who it was. But the whole thing is when you're doing a story arc, when you're doing an overreaching arc, that's how you build your run. And each book you do is building another building block. And you have to really be careful because each story you do has to fit in organically into showing us those different aspects of the character. Now, when I really think about doing a run, I think about building it like a mosaic, and I want to show how each cut piece fits in the overall mosaic of showing us this character. So each one of these books is like a tile in that mosaic, and each piece shows us a different aspects of their personality, a different aspect of their voice, and a different part of who they are. And all of those pieces show us a person we can relate to, a person we can identify with, and a person we can care about. Because when you're doing stories about heroes, you're doing stories about people, and you're doing a story about a person who has an impact on others and an impact on changing the lives of others. So that's what I see heroes as. And when you're doing a run, you want to show how this hero has impacted the lives of people in your stories. And you really want to show why this hero being here is important. So when I do a run of stories on a character, I want to show how that character is important over the course of each of those books and how this character made a difference in all of the lives of people in those stories. And that's another aspect that is very important to a run. And when you're doing a run, you want to show how this person has not only changed the lives of others, but has had to make changes in their lives themselves as a result of their experiences with other people. So there's different aspects to storytelling in a run, but the reader should come out of a run of stories getting to know a character, learning something about a character, and something that makes us see this person and see them as somebody they could see as respecting and admiring. So at the end of the run, you really want the reader to have a strong impression of the character. And as they make changes in their lives, we see how this hero is someone who is important to everyone. That's what I tried to do over the course with the ISIS series books, is show, why the goddess next door is important and why the girl next door is important to a community, and show us this girl next door and what makes her somebody special in our communities. Now, with the John Haynes character, I tried to do the same thing, and I'm starting to build his character transformation arc. And his character transformation arc started in the Temptation of John Haynes. Now, the Temptation of John Haynes laid the foundation for the JS Direct universe. And I wanted to show, again, with Temptation of John Haynes, the John Haynes character being this kind of common guy who nobody really thought much of. He didn't think much of himself. And he's given this great power as a CEO, but he also starts to show his example of Christ, which changes Eastein's life. And as he overcomes temptation, he learns how to deal with this new job and all of the challenges related to it. Now, it took me a while to start doing Man Who Rules the World, but Man Who Rules the World was a follow-up, And like Amari's Revenge, this was a reintroduction book, and the whole point of reintroduction books is to pick up on your story points in your previous book. And the whole thing with a reintroduction book is the reader has not seen this character in years. So what you want to do is make it where this book is like an entry point to the character. So with this one, I reintroduced the John Haynes character. I mean, he had made an appearance in Wrath of the Cyber Goddess, but I wanted to reintroduce readers to his world, reintroduce him to his mission, and reintroduce readers to why they should care about John Haynes and why he is the man who rules the world. And I wanted to do that by putting him on against the threat of the god Cassius character and having him to deal with this big epic challenge. So that was a way to reintroduce the character, reintroduce the kind of threats he deals with and the challenges he deals with. Now, after I did this story in 2016, I had left the character alone for a while again until Mike Williams came to me and said, we don't have any black masculine heterosexual characters out here because we have all these feminized beta male characters out here. And I decided to revisit the John Haynes character because we needed strong masculine heroes. So I, again, went back and reintroduced the character because it had been 2 years with a conversation with Death, picking up on story points in Temptation and Man Who Rules the World. And that was about, again, building that world. So this was the book that actually starts John's current transformation arc. And the whole thing is I built on those story points that were in the 2 previous books. And when you're doing runs, you want to be able to pick your story points and build on them. Now, as I started his character transformation arc, I followed it up with Dark Succubus, and Dark Succubus showed us some of John's character flaws and some of his issues that he was dealing with. And that was something that I wanted to do to show that he's not only dealt with Esteem's temptation, but he also had to deal with temptations from these other demons out here. And after I did that, I decided to pick up on a story point in Man Who Rules the World with Man with Nothing to Lose. And Man with Nothing to Lose picks up on a story point in the first chapter of Man Who Rules the World. So what you want to, whenever you're writing a run, you want to be able to pick your story points. And each story point is important as related to your story. Just for fun, Mobar 7170, who would I like to see cast as John Haynes? Well, I'm thinking about the guy who played Cyborg in Justice League. I think his name is Ray Fisher. I think he'd make a good John Haynes. I always wanted Michael Ealy, but when I look at Ray Fisher, that's his name. He would make a better John Haynes these days. I mean, he's young, he's fit, and I've seen him. He looks like John Haynes. So Ray Fisher, that's his name. That's the guy who I would go with. So. But Michael Ealy has a lot of the character traits, but Ray Fisher would be a better overall actor overall. But with John, I wanted to do a different type of character transformation arc because the John character was this introvert and loner. So I wanted to show the character learning how to work with people. And that's all part of his character transformation arc. I mean, I'm just starting to build his arc, starting to build his world. And that it's taking time, but that's the whole thing with runs, they can be anywhere from 4 issues to 12 issues to 60 issues. But the whole point of a run of stories is about really telling a grand story overall. With each story, you're telling a bigger story overall. And that's where a lot of writers get it mixed up about comics being like a novel. And comics really are not a novel. A novel is like the temptation of John Haynes. This is a novel. A novel is a complete story, and it tells its story and makes its points in one volume. I mean, if you could read Temptation of John Haynes and not have to read anything else. Mobar, I actually wanted Biggie Smalls to be the block. He was my original choice for the block was Biggie Smalls. He was inspired by Notorious B.I.G. But when you're doing a run, you want to be able to do your stories where each story is its own each individual story, but it's connected to certain story points. That's the difference between a comic and a novel. A novel is a story in one volume. We get the hero, we get what their conflict, and we see them overcome their conflict. But in a run of comics, you want to be able to have the hero beat the bad guys in each story arc, but each story arc is connected to this overreaching arc to go out here and build towards a overall arc which shows us this character. So that's where a lot of writers get it mixed up. They want to go with this novel thing, but novels are in chapters, and each chapter is a part of one story. It's not a part like a comic. A comic is a whole story, and once a comic is finished, you pretty much have finished that story. And if you finish 3 issues, you finish a storyline. And once that storyline is finished, it builds into another storyline, which builds into the overreaching arc. So that overreaching arc, again, is the thing that's most important, because when you go out here and you have that overreaching arc, that's the thing that the writer has to think about before they start putting the fingers to the keyboard. Because when you put your fingers to the keyboard, you're doing individual stories, but each story has to work together with other stories towards building that larger story arc, which makes us see this character, see what this character's mission is, and why we should care about that hero's mission, and see, that overall hero's journey. Because that hero's journey, this is what we're seeing in stories like a John Haynes or like in ISIS. We're seeing that hero's journey, and that's all part of writing comic runs, is showing us that hero's journey and showing us how each person is growing and developing and changing. And while they're growing and developing and changing, we are seeing some fantastic adventures, having some great escapes, and having a lot of fun. That's all part of a great comic run, is giving that reader that escape, giving them that fun, giving them that excitement, and giving them a reason to keep buying the stories and anticipating the next book in the series. That's all part of serialized storytelling, is when you do one story, getting readers excited for the next one, and showing us how this character is learning, growing, developing, and changing, how things in their life are growing, developing, and changing, and showing us that what makes them a hero and why it's important. And these are all aspects that a writer has to really think about when they're doing their stories. They have to really think about how their run is going to reflect on the character and how it will impact the character overall. Now, a lot of comic writers, when they're doing their plans for a run, like a Kurt Busiek, they want to see how it fits in with other writers' work organically. And guys like David Michelini, Bob Layton, Walt Simonson, they have to look at the history of the character so that when they're doing their stories, that they see that they fit in. Because if their stories don't fit, what happens is readers will reject their run and not see them as something that they want to read or even regard. So when you're doing a run, you're planning a run, you want to make sure that your work fits in organically. If you're working with another person's character, fits in with other writers and their aspects for the character. And what you want to do, again, is make sure that your work fits in with other writers' work. Now, if you're working on a new character or a series of new characters like I've been working with for the last 20 years, you don't really have to worry too much about seeing if your work fits in with other writers. But if you're working with an existing character or existing concept, you really have to think about those aspects as related to your storytelling. Because if your work doesn't fit consistently with other people's work, then people are going to have issues with you. And that's where a lot of people have issues with many of your woke or social justice writers, because the people have been reading these characters for 40, 50 years, and they don't see many of the aspects they know about the character being presented and made fresh for the 21st century all they see is somebody trying to push their political agenda, but not looking to tell stories that are similar to what they have known or experienced in previous years. So a lot of these writers, they want to come in and talk about they want to revolutionize things. But a good writer, they don't want to revolutionize things. What they want to do is create their run, where the run is where, yes, we know that this character is established, but what we want to do is bring some elements in order to make the character fresh for the 21st century. And we want to bring in maybe some new villains, maybe refresh some concepts for some new villains. Yakties will ask the question, who would I cast as Lucifer? Lucifer was inspired by Keith David, and whenever I write Lucifer, I always hear the voice of Keith David. So Keith David is who I want for Lucifer and nobody else. I mean, that's whenever I write the narration, I always use Keith David as a narration and the dialogue. So if you've ever heard Keith David on Gargoyles, or you heard him on other books, other movies he's done, you know he has this baritone voice, but I just like the way he carried himself, and he has this presence that makes you think of him as this kind of devilish. Mobar7170 asks, for an Easter egg in my upcoming catalog, what can we expect from the future for E-Steam, Matilda, Isis, and John Haynes? You're going to see Matilda in Eternal Night. She's got a cameo in that. And E-Steam is what I'm getting ready to do is Blast from the Past, which is a follow-up to Sands of Time. And I've done the John Haynes book for the year, which is The Man with Nothing to Lose. But we're going to see John pop up again in next year's Isis, Revenge of the Cyber Goddess. And we're going to see him in Taking Care of Business. And I want to eventually get Spinsterella's Summer Vacation, because I want to bring Matilda back. But I'm working on bringing Matilda back. We are going to see her in Eternal Night, and I want to get her back for Spinsterella's Summer Vacation. I'm just trying to come up with a plot for it. But I always saw, again, that's the 2021 catalog. I'm like halfway through it. I just got one E-Steam book to do, and I have the Isis one. It's 2/3 done. So once I get off the stream, I got to get back to work on Isis, Revenge of the Cyber Goddess. But that's all part of what I wanted to do this stream about, doing comic runs, because I thought I could share something about writing a run, because after doing, all of these books, I thought I could share something about doing a run of stories, because when I look at a lot of these woke writers, they come into writing and they don't have any guidance, and they don't really understand that when you're doing a run, it's supposed to make a statement. You're supposed to say something about these characters. And when you go out here, each story should be helping us see a clearer picture of this character, what makes them a hero, and what makes us care about them as heroes, and what makes us care about them as a hero and their mission in protecting people. Now, I'm going to get ready to wrap up tonight's stream. And you can pick up all of the books I talked about in the stream from the Isis series and the John Haynes series on Amazon.com in paperback and Kindle by going to my page. I'll leave a link to that in the chat. You can get all of my books by clicking the link in the chat, and get all my books from the link I just put up there. And you can also, if you want to see me make more videos and streams like this, you can donate to the Cash app. That helps me be able to pay for the internet, and it helps me be able to go out here and hire artists like your Mike Williams and your Bill Walko to design the covers for books like Isis, The Main Event, and John Haynes, The Man with Nothing to Lose. And if you want to continue giving monthly support to the channel, you can donate via Patreon, and that also is used again to pay for the internet and pay for the covers on books. All the monies that I get from donations are used towards going out here and paying for publications, paying to improve the quality of the publications. So I really appreciate everybody taking the time to come out to tonight's stream. I hope you learned something about runs and building a run of stories for a comic run, and be able to learn something about writing an overall overreaching arc, because the overreaching arc is very important. Each book you do in your series is supposed to build towards that satisfying conclusion, and each story arc you do, it's supposed to be followed again. It's supposed to build into each story. Each story builds into another story, and eventually we get this picture of this hero. And that's what writing a run is all about, giving us that picture of this hero, giving us this picture of their mission, and giving us a reason to care about that mission, and giving us a reason to connect with this character and see why this character is great. Again, I want to thank everybody for coming out to tonight's stream, and I hope you'll be there for next week's stream.